The second in our series of 3 talks on Shakespeare and race. Today we are very, very privileged to have Professor Eric Song from Swarthmore College here to talk to us. And just like the last time, if you would like to access closed captions, you can do so by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. We will hopefully have time for questions at the end of the session, so feel free to post some questions in the chat or to voice them when the time comes. But apart from that, I want to hand it over the time to Professor Song.
Hello, I'm Eric Song over from Swarthmore, so thanks for joining. Just out of curiosity, I don't know what's the best way to do this, little show of hand emojis or whatever, thumbs up. How many people here attended the previous talk with Professor Benson who has joined us? So a bunch. I see a lot of cool. I heard a little bit about the talk because I was chatting before the this event, and I hope there won't be too much overlap to make things too redundant. And in fact, I'd love to hear during the Q&A afterwards kind of what the meaningful and productive overlaps might be. Second question, how many of you guys are, fairly familiar with at least the plot of Othello? Because I think my talk kind of assumes some baseline familiarity, but I'll try not to make too many assumptions. Okay. In terms of format, I do have kind of a boring PowerPoint, and I'm going to run that so you don't have to look at my face the whole time. I actually encourage you to, if you have questions or concerns, if something is not very clear to you, or if you want to hear more, just unmute yourself and yell at me. I think it'd be fun to have kind of a disembodied voice, yelling, hey, that doesn't make any sense. What are you talking about? Or yell at me if I start cutting out and you can't hear me. Hopefully, I don't know exactly how long this will take, but hopefully we'll have some time for discussion at the end. So I'm going to share screen. All right. Is that working? Is the share screen working? Okay, cool. So my talk is titled The Racism of Jealousy from Othello to the Cuck. And as I'll talk about toward the end of my talk, this is kind of an extension of some scholarly work that is forthcoming. And it's an extension in 2 different ways. Number one, scholarly publishing is so ridiculously slow. I think I wrote the actual thing that's forthcoming in the next couple of months back, I don't know, in 2000, I know Obama was president. So I wrote it when Obama was president. So this is kind of stuff that I wish I could have said if academic publishing weren't so slow that I wrote it a long time ago. And also, it's the kind of stuff that I didn't know how to say in a scholarly essay published in a journal about Renaissance literature. So there you go. I'll start with just with some background. I hope it's not too boring, but I'll start before the Cuck. There's the Cuckold, a very, very tediously familiar figure in medieval and early modern literature. And if you're not familiar, Cuckold is just the slang term for a husband whose wife is cheating on him and he doesn't know about it. Curiously, etymologically, it does seem to derive from the cuckoo, like the bird. And even just saying that, you'll notice that there's some weird etymological inversions in the logic of the cuckold. Number one, the cuckold is kind of the victim, whereas the cuckoo bird is the one that lays its eggs in another bird's nest. And number two, of course, there's the gender inversion, right? So laying the eggs, but the cuckold is the victim of male sexual, I don't know, felt as predation or something, and his wife's infidelity. So the anxiety of being cuckolded is very pervasive in medieval and early modern literature, often as a joke. I don't know, a joke that is supposed to be serious, but still a joke. Endless banter about being cuckolded and taunts. So one famous thing that about cuckolding is uttered by the miller in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, who has no wife, he is no cuckold. You get the joke. It can cut in different ways. The only way you can be sure you're not going to be a cuckold is to have no wife, or conversely, if you have a wife, you're probably going to be cuckolded or something like that. I'll skip over the extensive details about Cuckold's the joke that they have horns. You can take a look at the examples from Much Ado About Nothing if you like. But that's the other bit of just tedious, endless jokes, right? So the idea, apparently the actual source of this belief is rather opaque and we're not 100% sure where it comes from, but the basic gist is cuckolds grow horns and they don't realize it. So everyone else can tell they're a cuckold from their horns, but they don't realize it because you can't see the top of your own head. All right. So my talk is not about the cuckold necessarily, but about this slur that has developed and is now, regrettably, I guess, in fairly common parlance. I don't know if anyone actually uses it or now only uses it as a joke, but I guess that's part of how this kind of discourse operates. From the cuckold to the cuck. I think it's useful to cite a 2017 blog entry from the website Better Living Through Beowulf. It's now become a well-established trend that medievalists have zany blogs, I guess. This one is by the medieval historian Robin Bates, who says, hey, we all know about cuckolds, all of us who study medieval and early modern literature. Maybe it's worth taking seriously this insult. Cuck, short for cuckservative. And I think that's, number one, a pretty useful reminder that the slur seems to have started, I guess. It's not a slur against like those perceived as being liberals. It's actually an alt-right slur for conservatives who aren't nationalistic enough. So I think the most important thing that Bates quotes here is from this Daily Beast article, also 2017, that says, Donald Trump's chief strategist, Stephen Bannon, who we all probably recognize, let's say we now cite him as an architect of Trump's campaign and of his white nationalist agenda, has called the president's senior advisor and son-in-law, Jared Kushner, a cuck and a globalist. And I think that's key, right? So I want to signal that term globalist. I want to point out that Jared Kushner is Jewish, so that's important for the logic of my talk. So Jared Kushner is the cuck in Stephen Bannon's eyes, at least according to this Daily Beast article. So we can start there and think about the cuck as a political slur based entirely on a longstanding trope of male sexual anxiety used by the so-called alt-right against those perceived to be insufficiently committed to white nationalism and therefore are so-called globalists. If you Google cuck, you'll get lots of terrible things. I think the definitions found on urbandictionary.com are actually kind of interesting. It's kind of a real-time, horrific experiment in lexicography. First, you'll get a 2017. That seems to be, at least in my Google research, a real hot spot for talking about this rhetoric. A man who lets his wife or girlfriend have sex with other men. Often the man lets her do whatever she wants. Okay. Definition 3, which I have not quoted because it seemed too inappropriate, but it refers derisively to the sexual fetish or category of pornography of husbands watching themselves being cucked in real time, right? So in this case, the failure to live up to male norms of proprietary control is actually acknowledged and a source of fetishistic humiliation pleasure, right? That might be familiar to some of you. If it's not, sorry, there you go. And I think for me, for this talk, maybe the most important is definition number 6 by user Bearded Villain. Contrary to the beliefs of the liberal-leaning crowd trying to explain something popularized by the conservatives, cuck is used by many races for someone who is spineless and is derived from cuckold. So that part, that for me is like the fascinating bit, right? Liberals, stop pretending you know what this is talking about. And the idea, I think, you don't have to read too much into it. Cuck is used by many races, implying this is not a racist term. It's actually just a male anxiety term or something, right? A masculinist term, not racist, something like that. It gets worse. If you put cuck in YouTube, you will learn that there was a 2019 movie called Cuck. I'm very proud to say I have not watched this movie, but the trailer suggests it is kind of what you expect. It traces a loser who becomes radicalized and violent because he's a loser or something like that. You will also find Gavin McInnes, who made a lot of money as a co-founder of Vice magazine. You might know him as, I think, either one of or the founder of the racist hate group, the Proud Boys. That's him. And he has a podcast or something. And he makes fun of the trailer. So it's kind of in the spirit of Bearded Vellon's UrbanDictionary.com, definition. No, you've gotten it all wrong. You liberals always pretend you know what this is all about. This is just some sad liberal fantasy of right-wing radicalization. So there's that. So my talk is all about what can Othello still teach us about this kind of formation, right? And some of maybe the answers will be a little too obvious, and I think that's what my talk is about too. But let's start with the proposition that Othello is likely still the most influential depiction of jealousy, conjugal jealousy, a husband's wrongful jealousy in the English language. I think it's almost certainly the most influential depiction of interracial love, and let's say the tragic consequences of racism, if you want to put it that way, in the English language. I'll point out something I'll return to. To the best of our knowledge, there are no actual cuckolds in Othello. This is a tragedy brought about by the fear of being cuckolded, turning tragic and violent into something far more serious than a joke. With that in mind, I want to ask, what can it teach us now about this particular 2017-ish political discourse? To get at that question, I think I'm going to start with the proposition that Othello, one of the reasons it's so useful is that it's an effective communicator of a very Christian understanding of jealousy into a play that actually actively overturns any supernatural claims of causation. Most famously, is Iago a devil? No, not really. You don't need supernatural causation to explain anything in Othello, even though it has been cited as a very Christian, particularly Christian tragedy among Shakespeare's high tragedies, with Othello being labeled the most Christian tragic hero of all of Shakespeare's tragic heroes. More specifically, I think it's important to point out that if he's the most Christian, he has the eagerness of a recent convert, because he is a convert, and that's very important. To understand why I think it's so important that we think of Othello as communicating or translating a kind of theological religious structure into, a less overtly necessarily theological form of dramatic entertainment. Just very quickly, for those of you guys who don't really have deep knowledge of this or don't care, you might remember that Christianity develops as an offshoot, right, of the Hebraic religion, one that actually claims to redefine the Hebrew scriptures as well as Israelite history, right? It's not that the Hebrew Bible is false or anything, although there were some strands of that kind of thinking very early on in the history of Christianity. It's more that the Israelites themselves did not understand the full significance of their own religious experience and their relationship to God, right? So that's the key structure that's really important for what I'm trying to get at here. Why does that matter for jealousy? For jealousy, conjugal jealousy, in the Hebrew Bible, the conjugal jealousy is a metaphor that is often called upon to uphold an exclusive and nation-specific covenant between God, Yahweh, and his chosen nation, Israel. So in the perhaps most familiarly in the Ten Commandments, Israel is forbidden from worshiping other gods or bowing down to idols because the Lord thy God is a jealous God. There's an entire book of the Hebrew Bible in which the prophet Hosea is actually instructed to marry a so-called harlot so he can experience what it feels like to be wedded to an unfaithful woman. The lesson there being that's what it's like to be God. Maybe that's putting it a little too crudely, but I think that's the gist. As Regina Schwartz points out in a book all about the violent legacy of monotheism, monotheistic theology is obsessed with the possibility and actuality of betrayal, and in such a way that desire for God and human desire are made analogs of one another. And that's where this trope of jealousy becomes kind of prominent. I think Othello picks up and builds, and it's not, I think it's clearly true, Othello picks up and builds on kind of a Christian, specifically Christian problem when it comes to the question of jealousy. As I mentioned very briefly, one stake of Christianity is to redefine the Hebrew Bible and of Israel's relationship with God. And when we get to the question of marriage, Paul's epistle to the Ephesians has perhaps the most important redefinition of what marriage actually means under a Christian understanding of truth. I'll read this, I've excerpted it, but I'll read it and dwell upon it at some length because it's really important in terms of how weird it is the more you think about it. This is what Paul actually says. He has just quoted the definition or formula of marriage provided in the book of Genesis. And now Paul says, wives, submit yourselves unto your husbands as unto the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. Wife loveth himself, for we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. Just two things that I want to point out that make this passage particularly dynamic and weird, the more you think about it. Number one, wives are taught to esteem their husbands as if they are like Christ. So apparently the number one criteria, determiner of who gets to be like Christ in a heterosexual union, as we would call it, is gender. Men are like Christ because Christ was a man, or something like that, right? That seems to be the definitive category. And yet, if I excerpted the whole teaching, it would become even clearer. Husbands and wives are both members of Christ's body, the church, right? And Christ's body is imagined here as Christ's bride. So even though the gender identification is strict along one line, it completely makes no sense along the other. Husbands are like Christ. Of course, Christ was a dude, your husband's a dude. But wives and husbands alike are part of Christ's corporate bride. So that's one aspect of the weirdness. Maybe the more relevant one for this particular talk is the claim about inclusion, right? This is supposed to be a radically, even the singular marriage is supposed to be a sign of a radically communal, theoretically universal community, or at least international community, right? Of all Christian believers. We're all members of Christ's bride, the church, right? How does that work? That tension between any individual marriage and this radically inclusive body that is supposed to replace a nation-specific relationship to God, right? And that's one of the fundamental differences that Christianity claims from a so-called Hebraic past. I'll just point out elsewhere, the same Apostle Paul can be super emphatic about how communal belonging in the Christian church, sorry about the typo, renders all forms of difference irrelevant. There's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither bond nor free, there's neither male nor female. So something that might be roughly analogous to very important racial or at least ethnic difference. That's, according to this passage, irrelevant, and so is gender. How do we make sense of all these different layers of Pauline teaching? We might actually point out that there's one additional irony. The Hebrew Bible actually describes many instances of polygamy and concubinage, whereas Christianity would go on to very strongly endorse monogamy. So how are Christian couples supposed to reconcile a normative demand for exclusivity and gender hierarchy with the supposedly higher truth of radical inclusion and belonging? I'm not making that up at all. It was very palpable as a series of weird problems to negotiate in the 17th century. Here's the poet John Donne with perhaps one of the most pithy formulations of this problem. This is a poem that's all about Donne fretting about why are there embattled denominations? Why is there Roman Catholicism and Protestantism? Which one should I choose? But he expresses that dilemma like this: show me, dear Christ, thy spouse so bright and clear. So he's picking up very much on the biblical metaphor of Christ's church is his bride. And the sonnet ends like this: who is most true and pleasing to thee then, when she is embraced and open to most men. That's supposed to be shocking, right? So Donne has expressed his claim, I wish there was an inclusive ecumenical church that transcends denominational divisions with this kind of claim. I wish, Christ, your bride, well, not I wish, your bride should be most pleasing to you when she embraces most men. To put it in the offensive language of this particular talk, I think Donne is calling Christ a cuck, that he's supposed to be a cuck, right? That's how it's supposed to work according to some configuration of the metaphors that are available to him scripturally. Now to Othello with all that in mind. right? If you'll remember, Othello begins with reports, urgent reports, that Othello and Desdemona have run off and married secretly. Othello, the Moor, he's Black and he's a Muslim convert, but he is respected as a military leader in Venice. He has been embraced, and now he has run off and married a Venetian woman secretly. Recent scholarship, and I've just posted screenshots of two relatively recent books, have emphasized that this play picks up at the end of a certain kind of narrative structure. That narrative structure, familiar from Italian Romance epic, is exactly what this sounds like. A Muslim warrior has converted to the European Christian side and has married a European heroine. That is supposed to be the culmination of conversion and acceptance. So Othello too has been embraced as Venetian, and now his marriage to Desdemona might promise to culminate his story of conversion and acceptance. So the question, of course, is what goes wrong? Why is this a tragedy instead of a story of loving marriage culminating this kind of incorporation into the Venetian state of Christians? Here's one very familiar answer that was provided by the philosopher Stanley Cavell. He's a philosopher who has dabbled heavily in Shakespeare scholarship and is quite influential. I am reducing a very complex argument, so hopefully I'm not doing injustice to it, but to put it in a nutshell, Cavell points out that uncertainty about another person or another person's mind is probably just a part of the human condition. I won't ever have full certainty of what you're thinking. You could be plotting on slapping me in the face. I don't know. You could hate me. I don't know. Whatever it is, there's always some uncertainty. Radical skepticism might actually be motivated by a desire to surmount this limitation. I won't get too much into that. But if that's a primarily philosophical matter, one that we might associate with Descartes, roughly contemporaneous with Shakespeare, Cavell thinks Shakespearean drama kind of understands this and tests its tragic implications. When it comes to Othello, Cavell's claim, part of it, is that there's so much intense pressure on Othello to rely on his new wife's affirmation of him. And this has everything to do, of course, with his racial and religious background as a Moorish convert. So just a few snippets that might get at what it means in Cavell's reading, and I think this is accurate, for Othello to feel that he is loved and accepted by Desdemona. Desdemona, testifying as to why she fell in love with him, I saw Othello's visage in his mind. That's why she fell in love with him. Think about all the things that could mean, right? I saw his face in his mind. I overlooked his Blackness because I saw his mental faculties. That could be one way of thinking about it. As Cavell himself points out, it could also mean I saw Othello's face as he himself sees himself in his mind. How does he see himself? Does he see himself as Black or not? Or, how does he see himself? It's not clear, but it's pretty dynamic. Here's Othello later describing what it would mean if Desdemona has been unfaithful to him, as he is starting to suspect. Her name, that was as fresh as Diane's visage, the face of the goddess of chastity, is begrimed and black as mine own face, right? So her reputation is black as my own face is, clearly indicating that there is at least a very strong association in Othello's own mind with his physical Blackness and a sense of moral Blackness or something like that. Cavell's central claim is that in Othello's need or demand for just absolute certainty of Desdemona's loving affirmation, Othello ends up putting her in the place of God, or perhaps more accurately in the place of Christ. And this could only have tragic consequences. You can't have that kind of relationship with another human. We're just humans. We'll never know for sure, right? But Othello has almost a religious stake, or in making Desdemona kind of the guarantor of his worthiness, if you want to put it that way. Answer number two, kind of simpler, but it's probably more relevant to my talk, but it relates to Cavell's answer in ways that we need to consider. It's just the racism of jealousy. Answer number two is that Iago is the most overtly racist character in the play, and he will not allow Christian marriage to function as a vehicle of inclusion. In other words, jealousy is a potential religious cultural problem within Christian marriage that Iago seems to be very good at activating. I'll remind us of something I mentioned before. As far as we can tell, there are no actual cuckolds in Othello. There's no cheating. Only a fear of being cuckolded that Iago can deliberately transmit to Othello as a way to sabotage him. Here's where I think things get really important for what, hopefully, if Othello can speak at all to our present moment. For most of the play, here's what we are led to believe. The play actually tricks us. Othello can control his own feelings of jealousy, and he can manipulate them for his own purposes. I should mention that at the very opening of the play, Iago tells, well, a character that he's duping, and us, that he hates Othello for purely professional reasons. Othello has promoted another guy, Cassio, to the rank of lieutenant. And Iago says he's pissed about this because Iago feels that he was next in line and most deserving. And so he actually claims that he hates Othello. He doesn't actually say, I'm only racist for professional reasons. But I mean, he actually says, I hate Othello the more because of these professional gripes that I have. And it feels like he's a guy who can deploy his racism, you know, for coherent reasons, let's say. And when Iago soliloquizes to us as the audience, he seems to suggest something like, I am in control of my racism and I am using it, my racist jealousy, and I'm using it to advance my professional gripe and vengeance. I hate the more, he tells us, and it is thought abroad that twixt my sheets he has done my office. That's the curious part. He doesn't say who has been saying this. You know, people have suggested that Othello slept with my wife. I know not if it be true, but I, for mere suspicion in that kind, will do as if for surety. I'll leave it to your own sensibilities what you make of that. I don't know if something is true, but I'm going to pretend it's true because it helps my cause and my feelings about this cause. Some of you might think that doesn't make any sense at all. You can't pretend something is true and you know it's probably not. Others of you might say, oh, I know what that feels like. Oh yeah, I can hate someone by pretending something's truer than it is. Iago is very explicit in this play that he believes that we can use our reason to exert control over our bodies and passion. Here's Iago's second soliloquy. For that I do suspect the lusty Mawr hath leapt into my seat, the thought whereof doth like a poisonous mineral gnaw my inwards, right? All of a sudden, since we've heard the first soliloquy, we might think, man, you're pretty good at this, Iago. By this point, you already believe Othello has slept with your wife and it's gnawing your innards, right? That's pretty good. You really did a number on yourself to make yourself hate Othello more. Here's what I think is super important. Much later in Act 4, and this line just kind of comes and goes. No one in the play stops to remark on it, but it's a stunning revelation. Iago's own wife, Emilia, says this: some such squire he was that turned your wit the seamy side without and made you to suspect me with the Mawr. Emilia just drops for me what's a bombshell. There was some dude that made you believe, wrongly is a very strong insinuation, that Othello slept with me. And that wasn't true at all. And also, it made you really stupid. It turned your wit the seamy side without, right? That's, I think, for me, the bombshell revelation that Iago had been in the grip of wrongful, likely wrongful, sexual jealousy concerning Othello from the start. It wasn't just some kind of self-manipulating tactic that he used to make himself hate Othello all the more. So if we pause there, I think we can begin to lay out some answers to the question, what can Othello teach us about this rhetoric of the cuck, right? I have labeled these some relatively easy occasions for armchair psychoanalyzing. By relatively easy, I was making assumptions. For me, I feel like these are things that you can say at a liberal arts college and it makes sense. And it's probably true to us, right? Number one, sexual jealousy is a strategy of racism, but it's not one that's fully in control of the racist who deploys it. Number two, the amazingly intense fear of interracial cuckoldry, the fascination with it, can come to resemble a desire to witness being cuckolded. This is something that Iago actually plays on when he stokes Othello's jealousy. When Othello says, prove it for sure, because I need absolute proof, right? Ocular proof is the really famous phrase. And Iago says, but how? How satisfied, my lord, would you, the supervisor, grossly gape on, behold her topped? Do you want to watch her having sex with another man? Is that what you want? And Othello can only respond, death and damnation. So I think there's something fascinating going on with this. Iago playing on, of course the answer is no. Othello wouldn't want to see that at all. But of course there's also a kernel of yes, because that would offer decisive proof that he is a cuckold. Number 3, maybe the easiest of us all, easiest of these all, the shared, transmitted, and intensely misogynistic fear of cuckoldry can be the basis of a homoerotic bond. Othello demands that Iago share the grounds of suspicion towards Desdemona, if thou dost love me. And Iago says, you know, my lord, you know I love you. That's an echo, I think, pretty clearly of what Peter says to Jesus. But it's also, I think, not too hard, at least for us, to say there's something homosocial bordering on the homoerotic going on there in this bond of male-male intensity being forged over misogynistic suspicion. Later, the two share an oath of misogynistic violence that is clearly indicative, clearly reminiscent in a farcical, dark way of a marriage vow. So Iago is finally promoted and he says, I am thine own forever, right? I'm your own forever. Maybe one slightly less obvious thing to say, and it'll be clear now maybe why I structured the talk the way that I did. I think Othello is useful in showing us that a religious concept like biblical jealousy can be effectively communicated into a less overtly theological narrative, one of interracial love and citizenship. And this kind of lesson can serve as one reminder of the internal connections that exist between anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism, and why those connections might persist even when Christian typology, the claims of the Christian Bible on the Hebrew Bible, the so-called Old Testament, that doesn't seem as relevant or fresh to our concerns and our thinking, but that latent connection still matters. For me, one very graphic example of that was in the 2017 Unite the Right rally. I can't believe that was 3 years ago, but maybe some of you guys watched on the news. You remember these the Tiki Torch racists? They actually had descended on Charlottesville, Virginia, ostensibly to protest against the removal of Confederate statues, right? So this was an expression of, it should have been just clearly anti-Black racism. But one of their chants that we all, if we watched the news footage, heard clearly was, Jews will not replace us. Now, at one level, that's kind of obvious. We get it, you're Nazis, so you chant stuff like that. On the other hand, it makes zero sense at all, right? If there's a demographic anxiety, that's correct. Jews are not replacing you. That's not your anxiety. You could have said, you know, I don't know, Latinos will not replace us, Asians will not replace us, I don't know. But they have apparently found it abundantly satisfying to yell that Jews will not replace us. So this might go back to the Steve Bannon, Jared Kushner globalist kind of thing, right? That all of a sudden, Jews still stand for this notion, this problem for nationalism, but with a very key historical twist that I can only gesture towards because it's such a massive kind of thing. But I have suggested that for Christianity in its inception, the Old Testament was an internal kind of affront or challenge to Christianity's claim for universalism. Now, all of a sudden, we are applying, and not all of a sudden, now after a very long history, we are applying the label of, you know, of Jew to, or globalist, or even conservative, or whatever, to a challenge to a nationalist project, right? These people are now way too committed to a global network, and they're enemies of nationalism. I feel like if my talk just ended right there, maybe that would make a kind of sense, and we can talk through things. Did that make sense? Did that not make sense? But I want to muddy things up a little bit and make it a little more, I don't know if I'm just making it more complicated or trying to make it more scholarly. But I think there is a kind of methodological challenge, and that is, I have suggested that some of these forms of thinking might be easy and persuasive for us in this kind of liberal arts college setting. But what's the vocabulary that makes it kind of these kinds of cultural diagnoses or armchair psychoanalyzing diagnoses, what vocabularies do we have to make them more persuasive? I don't know. I don't think you're ever going to convince the tiki torch racist guy. Hey, I'm a professor and I've read Othello. I think I understand what's going on with you. I don't think I'm persuading that guy, but at least general public. What is the vocabulary that we have to describe these patterns that are historical and are legible and are still producing these crazy affective distortions, right? I don't know if producing is the right word, but shaping them at least. I'll point out that the remarks in this talk have been an extension of my forthcoming article titled Othello and the Political Theology of Jealousy. And I'll just signal that political theology, that phrase, is a particular phrase that refers to a particular mode of making claims about a religious past in relation to a nominally secular or not really secular modernity. And political theology is a discourse that has a kind of concrete history. And at the risk of being tawdry, it is a history that, yes, revolves around one guy who's kind of a part-time Nazi and another guy who is a German Jewish scholar who had to flee Germany, right? It's very regrettable, but that's how this thing works. Carl Schmitt on the left is kind of the foundational thinker of political theology as a mode of thinking about the religious past in relation to political modernity. You'll see in 1922, he wrote a book called Political Theology. He ended up joining the Nazi Party in 1933. He left the party soon afterwards because he was estranged. To put it in a nutshell, we think he wasn't enough of a Nazi, but that's not particularly exculpatory. He was a lifelong defender of fascism. So he is kind of this prominent anti-liberal thinker, illiberal, anti-liberal theorist. On the right, you have Ernst Cantorowitz. His major contribution to this discourse comes decades later, as you'll see, The King's Two Bodies, a study in medieval political theology. I think if you just think about these two figures, and they are two prominent figures in the 20th century who have proposed this thing called political theology, you'll see what I mean by the methodological challenge of how to link a religious past to a modern present. Schmitt, in his early work, Political Theology, this is one of his very frequently quoted assertions. He says, all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, right? I know that's a little weaselly because he says all significant, but still, it's a very strong claim, right? That basically all modern theories of the state are just secularized theological concepts. That's a very powerful inducement to study religious ideas and theological patterns, if that's true, and they persist in modernity. Here's Cantorowitz in his study of medieval political theology, massively influential, studying a particular notion that he thinks makes the king kind of Christ-like in a very particular way. He's very nervous in the preface. He says, this study may be taken, among other things, as an attempt to understand basically modernity, right? Not just the Middle Ages, but the 20th century. And then he says, it would go much too far, however, to assume that the author felt tempted to investigate the emergence of some of the idols of modern political religion. Why is it a temptation to try to think, hey, does your medieval political theology, this massive book that you wrote, does it help to explain some of our modern dilemmas? He says, that would be going too far. I wasn't tempted to do that. Those were kind of afterthoughts. So I quote those just to point out that the much stronger connection of much stronger assertion of a connection between a religious past and a modern politics is made from kind of the Nazi standpoint, right? And whereas it's Cantorowitz who's much more nervous about making that kind of strong connection. I only mention that because I want to point out that part of the work that I was trying to do in my earlier essay was a response to Schmitt's understanding of Shakespearean drama. In 1956, so much later, right, a couple decades after his boot from the Nazi Party, but he's still a jerk, he turns to Hamlet and he asks why that play has been so powerful for so long. And for me, what's really interesting here is that he actively rejects a Freudian psychoanalytic understanding of that play and its central taboo. most of us will just be aware, at some level, implicit or explicit, that Hamlet, according to the Freudian account, is the definitively important early modern version of the Oedipus myth. We know why that play is so powerful. If we've watched Mel Gibson humping Glenn Close, it's because it's the early modern version of the Oedipus myth, right? Schmidt has no patience for that kind of understanding. He says there is a taboo operating. That's why the play is so powerful, but it's a historical taboo. I don't want to get into it, but it's basically King James I of England had a very scandalous non-relationship to his mom. It wasn't an Oedipal kind of thing at all. It's just that his mom had this crazy life and politically fraught and was a Roman Catholic. So he had a fraught relationship to his mother. So he thinks the mommy issues are historical. Why that's important is Schmidt is trying to claim that objective, so-called objective real political history can help to explain aesthetic effects. The problem, of course, is that Schmidt's understanding of objective history is this kind of narrative of how the modern state has to come to be, to put it reductively, and in a way that underwrites modern authoritarianism or something like that. In my previous essay, which again is maybe not the thing that I would write now if I could write it now, but my essay tried to point out that Othello really reveals weaknesses in Schmidt's claims about how Shakespearean tragedy works. I won't get into that. It's pretty boring. But basically, I think Schmidt's wrong. I don't think that's how it works. But I wanted to turn to that because I wanted to offer some final suggestions. Schmidt, I think, and this is not just something I pointed out, lots of people who read Schmidt know this. Schmidt's thinking often contains lots of mythic and affective appeals masquerading in the name of hard, objective historical reality and necessity. And I think this is how he describes a forward-moving history that aims toward modern state power. My own hunch, and this is what I want to end with, is that this kind of rejection of psychoanalytic understandings in the name of objective political reality is still a familiar characteristic of modern right-wing authoritarianism and its fanboys, right? I think this is, in a certain way, kind of definition, the third definition I pointed out from urbandictionary.com. You liberals always try to claim these weird readings of racism or male anxiety or whatever it is you want to talk about. That's not true at all, right? So I think we might see this kind of claim about objective reality in the use of the slur cuck by the same people who refuse the very obvious to us diagnoses of what's wrong with them. So I end with a proposition that psychoanalysis might have been one vocabulary for diagnosing these kinds of ills, let's say male sexual anxiety intertwining with racist and anti-Semitic paranoia, but it has clearly limited purchase for lots of reasons in the 21st century. And so I end with, there's this challenge, and I don't know what the solution is, to find new vocabularies and rhetorical strategies to make our understanding of what might seem obvious to us. These people are, this is what's wrong with them, right? Convincing to a general public. So that's it. That's all I had to say. I'm looking forward to Q&A, hearing your thoughts. Questions, responses. I guess we have about 10 minutes. Questions, thoughts, angry tirades, etc.
If anyone has questions, you're free to either add them in the chat or
oh yeah, I can read the chat now.
Yeah, or you can just unmute yourself. I think you should have the ability to do that. Otherwise, I'll make sure you have the ability to do that right now. But yeah.
I'm right now trying to wrap my head around the idea, which I had forgotten from my last reading of Othello, that somebody had told Iago that Emilia was cheating on him, because and this is less relevant to where we've ended up in this talk, but it's just astonishing to me the idea that he's essentially doing to somebody else what someone else has already done to him, and the sort of reenactment of that which made him upset and jealous and almost traumatized in this scenario. But of course, he takes it a step further because in his own experience of like being cuckolded, there is no element of racism.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a full-time Shakespearean, so I don't want to speak definitively, but my sense and my impression is that moment doesn't get as much reaction in the scholarship that I think it deserves. I mean, it is a crazy claim, and I think it's part of kind of the play is dizzying the more you think about it, because it really does lead us to question what we know at every level. Like, we don't really know anything. We don't know if Iago actually is a good soldier like he claims he is. We don't know if Othello is a good soldier like he claims he is. Other people believe it. We never actually see him fighting except in cases where he's not good at it. So we don't know anything by the end. But we, that bit about Amelia, I think, is one of those moments where when she says it, and there are other moments in this play, like when she says it, we know she must be speaking the truth. We just kind of know, right? That's true. That must be true. Iago must have been lying to himself and us by not mentioning this. So it kind of punctures the radical doubt. And yeah, and I think the undefined nature of some squire makes the ultimate source, let's say in our parlance, of the racist sexual anxiety. The real source is always out there. It's always some other guy, right? It has some kind of other origins. And for me, part of my work in this article is trying to really lay out, maybe some of it being obvious already, but lay out kind of those sources are kind of really, let's say, internal to the idea of Christian marriage. It's not some dude, right? It's actually much deeper sources of causation that the play is dramatizing in that way.
And I don't have an answer myself to this next statement that I'm going to make, but I'm thinking about the clips from the production of Othello that Professor Benston showed us last time, which had Iago played by a Black actor. And then what does the kind of juxtaposition of his race, but not being a Moor and not being a convert, how does that make his own perceived cuckolding different from Othello's perceived cuckolding? Simply because he was already, per se, a Christian, if we can assume that based on that casting choice. I haven't seen the entirety of that production, so I cannot speak on the whole.
I mean, I think that's really useful. I think it has been, I think things might be changing now, but it has been a very useful reminder to point out that the overriding interest in race is not the whole story, that it's kind of our story, right? So obviously, religion is a big one, right? That Othello is, he's not just Black. There was even a debate about how Black Othello is. I think it's kind of silly. He's pretty Black. But it's actually, he's Muslim and he's a convert, so that's huge, right? He's also old. He actually is very clear about that, right? So there's also the common kind of, older man, younger woman anxiety. We tend to forget about that, although scholars do bring it up. So there are different kinds of patterns of, male sexual anxiety and its relationship with other configurations that Othello is thinking through. So that's really important, right? This has nothing to do with your comment on Iago, but maybe riffing on that a little bit, I'll just point out, maybe this is tawdrier than anyone wanted to be, but in kind of the racist kind of logic of the Cuck, right? I mean, you think of, this is not unfamiliar at all, the male sexualized body, that's part of the big, I don't know, spoken, unspoken kind of part of the logic of the Cuck, right? If you think about Othello, it's actually kind of fascinating. What do we learn about Othello's penis, actually? We do learn something. It's that he's circumcised. We learn about it at the very end of the play. And we learn about it in a roundabout way. So this is not something that I'm bringing up. I mean, it's the basis of a very powerful reading by Julia Reinhardt-Lupton, who reminds us of this fact as a very important fact. And at the end of the play, he actually can't even say, I'm circumcised. He's about to kill himself. And he remembers in his very last a famous speech, right? I did an act of service to Venice once. I took the circumcised dog by the throat and I smote him thus, except this time he spites himself. So there already, I mean, I think that's a kind of fascinating link between the rhetoric of the Cuck and whatever Othello is up to and thinking through. That shows us kind of a epochal shift. for him, I mean, the revelation is he is circumcised because he used to be Muslim, and that's a huge thing. Oh, I mean, it's a huge disclosure if you're really fascinated by it. No one really talks about it at the end of the play, but for someone like Julia Reinhardt Lupton, that really gives away the bodily marker of difference. It's not just skin color; it's religious difference that's been inscribed onto his body.
I guess I have sort of a question, which is a little more vague, but just sort of something to throw out there, which is that the other group of people in a lot of like medieval-ish, or I'm not entirely sure it's the medieval period, but at least many historical depictions of Jews are also marked with horns. And I'm wondering if there's some connection there and whether that, you know, what gave rise to what, or whether they sort of became one and the same as both depictions existed. And so I sort of just...
I did think about that in preparing my remarks for this talk, but I don't know, because I'm certainly not like an expert in the history of the Cuckold horns. And I am actually not an expert in the history of medieval anti-Semitism, which is a very familiar topic. So I don't know if those two folk, I don't know if they're folk traditions, if you want to call them that, if those two traditions converge or not. I'm not sure. But yeah, I thought of that too, but I'm not sure. I mean, that would be really interesting because of the logics of what you know about yourself and what you hide and what other people can see about you would be inverse, right? So the whole thing about the cuckold is you don't know you have the horns and everyone's laughing at you. So yeah, sorry, I don't have a better answer, but I thought of it too, and I should have researched further.
I thought a little bit about what Jordan was talking about earlier with what having a black Iago means. And it kind of, the connection that I drew was like that this is often used by like the extreme right to criticize folks who are also right wing, but by using like a rhetoric that sometimes is used against them and sometimes is not, to kind of like push a group that you might see as one and the same, and to drive some kind of wedge between them. And like I think with that particular RSC production with a black Iago and a black Othello, puts it like, I think that makes the point pretty clearly as well, where it is somebody reproducing the same sort of violence onto another body that is in many ways by other people read similarly to them. But I think it's interesting when you take it from like this situation where it's Iago and Othello reenacting violence that has been done to them versus the alt-right weaponizing concepts that haven't been used to hurt them. It's just weaponizing them against people who you would think of as in the in-group with them.
No, I think that's really useful because if you want to put it a certain way, what might be painful to us in Othello, and I think the staging of Iago as black would undoubtedly amplify this, is kind of the poignancy of how hard Othello tries to be Christian and maybe even Venetian, right? So the famous thing that he says, he comes out when everyone's fighting because Iago has orchestrated chaos is, you know, have we all turned Turks, right? Not that Othello has ever been Turkish, but he has been Muslim, we think. So he's a very earnest to prove his Venetian Christian chops, right? So that would be, I think, a very interesting kind of maybe link between this kind of, I mean, it would be different. I think you put it really well, but I think it'd be different in terms of here we have the alt-right, you know, declaring their commitment to the cause of white nationalism and declaring that other people on the so-called right, and they like using that other phrase, which is much tamer, like rhino, Republican in name only. I guess that's not an alt-right phrase at all, but it's just a Republican phrase. This idea that if you don't believe in a certain cause, you're not really part of what we're doing. So I think that would be the kind of connection there that's really useful. And then to pit, of course, this seemingly ridiculous vocabulary of you're letting your country, you're letting yourself be cucked at the national level, if you want to put it that way. To put that kind of vocabulary on it is, you know, obviously kind of the link to what Othello was up to in the early 17th century.
One thing sort of I've noticed throughout the sort of discussion, especially around sort of the question of like a Black Christian Iago versus sort of a Christian convert of Othello, is there's this question and almost doubt of like like can you really convert, and like can you fully convert, and like if you cannot change your race, and so like there's this question of, because Othello is Black, his Christianity is always still in question. And I'm curious of how that may relate to today with an alt-right that is like focused so much on being like on white nationalism, and in the background of that is like white Christian nationalism, and who belongs to that like Christian nationalism there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fascinating in all sorts of different directions, right? I think going back to what I was mentioning that Julia Reinhard Lupton was saying about Othello and that question of inclusion, for her, like it's actually the riff on the circumcised penis. That's the physical marker. Maybe, I mean, I don't want to dismiss Blackness because that's obviously in play throughout the whole play, and it's the site of Othello's racial anxieties, but it's the circumcised body that's kind of the mark of physical difference that does not go away, even though, you know, it's in the New Testament. Christianity itself was committed to the question of, it actually caused a fracture. Do Christians need to be circumcised to convert? And Paul won, which I think was a brilliant tactical move, because it's hard to spread your new religion if you tell people you have to get circumcised to convert. But in any case, Paul preached, no, the real meaning of circumcision is in the heart. He said it's a spiritual meaning. But Othello is showing, no, this guy's actually circumcised, and it's like a site of difference that does not go away, even if you say Christianity is inclusive, right? But for us, of course, we're more interested, you know, from our modern perspective in the question of race, and that matters too. I think it's really interesting also. I don't know how Christian the alt-right thinks it is. It's hard to know. That's another thing to say. And the third thing I'll say is, I am really interested in, I'm not a serious scholar of it by any means, but I'm kind of casually interested based on what I have been working on just what Othello is interested in, marriage as a pathway to inclusion and citizenship, right? So let's say, you know, marriage as a pathway to naturalized citizenship is super interesting. And of course, with the twists and turns and weird ironies, we have Trump and Melania, naturalized citizens. So, you know, that is a really part of the weirdness, bizarro, fun, not fun house part of our political moment. But yeah.
Do we have time for one more, or are we out?
Probably just the last question, and then we're just about out of time. Well, we are out of time.
I apologize because I'm going to summarize this really poorly because it's been about a year since I've seen this video. But Brows Held High did a video a couple years ago on different adaptations of Shakespeare. And one of the ones he talked about was how Shakespeare, and specifically Othello, was adapted in I think it's technically Bollywood, like an Indian film, and how the racial tension was translated into caste tension. And I thought that was really interesting. It's a great video. You guys should watch it if you get a chance. Yeah, and I just thought that was an interesting translation. I just wanted to plug that real quick.
So I think I don't know anything about the video you're mentioning or the Bollywood adaptation. I don't do a lot of performance history type stuff, so I'm not really good on that kind of stuff. But just in and of itself, it sounds fascinating because part of what Othello, I think, also is really thinking about. I mean, when Iago talks about his vocational gripe at the beginning of the play, I don't think that's just a ruse or just a gripe, right? I think the play is very interested, and one of the things I didn't have time to talk about is how Venice is not a monarchy, and Shakespeare is very interested in staging Venice in a particular way, right? So that you're not born into titles necessarily, especially in the sense that Shakespeare represents Venice. Office-based stations of esteem, high social reputation, but you can also be replaced. That's really important to Shakespeare's depiction of Venice, right? That's kind of what, Othello is also very obsessed with his status as general. That means a lot, right? So that intention, that kind of office-based, replaceable, vocational sense of identity, in a society that is depicted as not thoroughly necessarily as invested in birthright and birth rank as Shakespeare's England might have been, is super interesting. And to put that whole structure into a kind of a caste narrative would be fascinating, right?
Yeah, if I'm remembering correctly, basically part of the setting of the film is, well, I forget if this is part of the film or just part of general Indian culture. I'm afraid I'm also not terribly knowledgeable on that. But I believe part of the setup was that caste is something that most people assume isn't super impactful anymore, but in a couple of places it's still incredibly impactful and can really dictate a lot about a person's life.
Yeah, I don't know how permeable versus impermeable caste boundaries are now. I actually don't know much about it at all, but I think that would be part of the relevance of kind of thinking through the Othello narrative of, an anomalous Moorish convert who is regarded as a hero by the Venetians. I mean, and then that collapsing would probably be pretty interesting.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to cut this really interesting discussion off. Thank you so much, Professor Song, for joining us for this series and for this really, really interesting talk. And thank you for everybody for participating. And we will have one last installation of this 3-part series on the 14th of November. This talk will be actually a panel at 7:30, and this will last an hour and a half instead of an hour, given that it is a panel. We will be talking about what's at stake between race-blind and race-conscious casting and the differences between the two of them. So moving more towards very blatantly theatrical, the very blatantly theatrical part of Shakespeare and Race. And we will be joined for that session by Professor Headley from Bryn Mawr. But I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your weekend and looking forward to seeing you guys at that 3rd installation.